Ethnicity and the Fantasy of Ethnicity by Michael Moskowitz, PhD. What follows is a reaction to the articles of Javier and Rendon, Herron, and Thompson. They are varied and complex, and I cannot hope to adequately touch on the richness of any one of them. Even though this article is divided into 3 sections, each section only very roughly corresponds to a particular preceding paper. The 3 sections are 1. The ethnicity of psychoanalysis. 2. Blackness. 3. There is no ethnicity. 1. The ethnicity of psychoanalysis. When I left the 1992 APA meetings in Washington, D.C., I went to pick up my son on his way home from summer camp. I looked forward to his return with more than eagerness. When we dropped him off, both my wife and I were sad and anxious. We tried half-heartedly and not very successfully to hide it. Our son seemed to be handling the departure much better than we were. As we were walking away from the airport gate, my wife and I joked about our view of how we might handle this departure if we were upper-class British parents with stiff upper lips. Cheerio. Ta-ta. See you at summer's end, or perhaps you'd rather continue directly on to boarding school, and the like. I don't know if people really talk like this anymore, or if they ever did. But as we walked away, I fantasized about how at least in the movies British parents cheerfully sent their sons off to war and adventure for the good and the glory of the Queen and the Empire. I know I could never send my children off in this way, yet there is something of this ideal that is part of me. It is an ideal that I both admire and disdain, and it is an ideal that is contained in an ethnic fantasy. Stone, 1979, persuasively argued that there were 4 causes for the development of what he calls an unfeeling culture. The lack of a unique mother figure in the first 2 years of life. The constant loss of close relatives. Siblings, parents, nurses, and friends through premature death, the physical imprisonment of the infant in tight swaddling cloths in early months, and the deliberate breaking of the child's will, through severe physical and mental punishment, all contributed to a psychic numbing, which created many adults whose primary responses to others were at best a calculating indifference, and at worst a mixture of suspicion and hostility, tyranny and submission, alienation and rage. p. 80. These attributes may now seem negative in our eyes, but they were undoubtedly of value in building the adaptive, productive, and at times creative British Empire. Only recently have we been able to acknowledge the downside of oppression and exploitation. There is very interesting recent work in psychoanalytic anthropology, such as Levine's chapter, 1990, that looks at infant environments in different cultures from a psychoanalytic perspective. There is much to learn about the limits of an average expectable environment. Hartmann, 1964, Good Enough Mothering, Winnicott, 1975, and their relation to cultural types. Now, British values, ideals, and child-rearing practices have unquestionably changed, though some aspects of an unfeeling ideal remain. Winnicott's life and work are powerful examples and agents of this continuing change. Winnicott was a product of British culture, but he was profoundly influenced by the work of Freud, a Jewish Austrian, and more profoundly by the work and the person of Klein, a flamboyantly Hungarian Jew. The complex ways in which Hungarian, Austrian, and Jewish culture came together in the British person of Winnicott to produce his work, which influences us all, would be difficult to disentangle. But he stands as an example to illustrate my first point, that psychoanalysis is now and in fact has always been a deeply multicultural endeavor. We have in current political debate sometimes equated multicultural with non-European, particularly Latino, African, and Asian cultures. I use it here more broadly to refer to a blending of diverse cultures. I think a community that integrated Eastern European Jewish and British cultures deserves to be called multicultural. And yet to say that psychoanalysis is multicultural is not to say that it is omnicultural. Responding to cultural change is an ongoing process. As we absorb and transform the impact of new influences, we are in turn transformed by them. Wolff, 1982, pointed out that most of the world, certainly the old world of Europe, Africa, and Asia, have been engaged in trade, including the slave trade, for millennia. Until the 15th century, the slave trade was colorblind. And Austria, at the very core of Europe, was at the center of trade between east and west along the Danube, and between the north and south through its Alpine passes. Thus, this European country that came to be seen by many as the center of Germanic culture had, in fact, over centuries, absorbed Asian, African, Middle Eastern, and other influences. I think it can reasonably be argued that centers of culture, like Freud's Vienna or today's New York or Los Angeles, are often the melting pots or maelstrom of many cultures. Vienna in Freud's time was the capital of Europe's largest empire, and probably the most cosmopolitan city in the world. It was also the most Jewish city in Europe, cf. Mitchell, 1974, page 434. In 1910, the Jews made up 8.7% of its population, more than a third of its university students, and reputedly 75% of its journalists. The Jewish population was probably the most assimilated in history. Yet, as Mitchell pointed out, both Zionism and modern anti-Semitism were born in the Vienna of Freud's day. And no matter how assimilated and anti-religious, there is no question that Freud considered himself a Jew and felt that Jewishness placed him in opposition to mainstream culture and was a source of inspiration. He wrote, "Nor is it perhaps entirely a matter of chance that the first advocate of psychoanalysis was a Jew. To profess belief in this new theory called for a certain degree of readiness to accept a situation of solitary opposition, a situation with which no one is more familiar than a Jew." 1924, page 222. And, "Because as a Jew I found myself free from many prejudices which restricted others in the use of their intellect, and as a Jew I was prepared to join the opposition and do without agreement with the compact majority." 1926, page 274. There is increasing consensus that ego psychology, despite its profound contributions, has had a restrictive influence on American psychoanalysis. Most psychoanalysts find something barren in it, something about its inability to talk about selves and passionate desires. It seems that ego psychology, as embedded in a conservative American medical culture, was in part an attempt to de-ethnize psychoanalysis, and that its emphasis on adaptation was part of the ethos of an adaptable immigrant to American culture trying blend into the melting pot. We know that it is no accident that desexualizing and de-ethnizing go hand in hand. Jacoby, 1983, powerfully documented the repression of psychoanalysis in the United States. He points out that many influential European analysts such as Fenichel, Jacobson, and Annie and Wilhelm Reich were Marxists committed to social change. Simmel and Oettingen established the Berlin Clinic to provide therapy to the poor and working class. Although some analysts in the United States, perhaps most notably from 1955, 1961/1988, and others of the early interpersonalist school, and Marcuse, 1955/1966, 1956, of the Frankfurt School continued a commitment to social change, it must unfortunately be conceded that their impact on mainstream American psychoanalysis has not been great. Though Freud was not a Marxist and thought many of Marx's assumptions psychologically naive, there is no question about his critique of mainstream culture. Freud wrote in a letter to Putnam, "The recognition of our therapeutic limitations reinforces our determination to change other social factors so that men and women shall no longer be forced into hopeless situations," cited in Tickle, 1978, page 142. And in Future of an Illusion, 1927. One thus gets the impression that civilization is something which was imposed on a resisting majority by a minority which understood how to obtain possession of the means to power and coercion. p. 6. And it is to be expected that these underprivileged classes will envy the favored ones their privileges and will do what they can to free themselves from their own surplus of privation. Where this is not possible, a permanent measure of discontent will exist within the culture concerned. It is understandable that the suppressed people will develop an intense hostility towards a culture whose existence they make possible by their work, but in whose wealth they have too small a share. In such conditions, an internalization of the cultural prohibitions among the suppressed people is not to be expected. On the contrary, they are not prepared to acknowledge the prohibitions, they are intent on destroying the culture itself, and possibly doing away with the postulates on which it is based. p. 12. It seems to me that Freud was talking about himself, his own people, and psychoanalysis. This is in Future of an Illusion, 1927, a book in which Freud attempts to undermine one of the basic postulates of Western civilization, religion and the belief in God. Elsewhere, 1910, he wrote, "Since we destroy illusion, we are accused of endangering ideals," page 147. For Freud, the task of psychoanalysis was not only to liberate the individual from the illusions of childhood, but to liberate us also from the illusions of civilization. It also appears that Freud is making explicit a motivation for revolution. He speaks to the futility of mainstream culture's attempt to force its values on those that it oppresses. As Freud pointed out elsewhere, 1930, and as historical and psychological studies have confirmed, the superego is a fragile and labile structure. Its maintenance requires the support of idealized leadership and community. I dwell on these points because psychoanalysis often confronts the accusation that it represents or is the product of mainstream, middle-class European culture or the like. It may have become that in practice, but it is not in theory or origin. Our discipline in many ways has become comfortably mainstream, in part out of economic self-interest, but in large part out of internalized racism and fear. Fear that our ethnicity will be discovered along with our sexuality and the potentially revolutionary nature of our endeavor. 2. Blackness. This is a difficult topic, and in all circumstances, including the clinical situation, discussion must begin with the recognition of the reality of pervasive and oppressive racism. Thompson, this issue, has poignantly portrayed the constant awareness that African Americans and others designated Black have of their Blackness. It is astounding to hear that for many Black families the question, what color is the child, precedes, is it a boy or a girl? The questioner is asking, what chance, what place will your child have in the world? As Thompson said for Black patients, Blackness permeates all aspects of their being. This is the nature of trauma, that it permeates all aspects of being, and we must recognize that Black people in this culture have been traumatized, many by the reality of poverty and discrimination, and all by the daily narcissistic assault of living in a racist society. Freud was personally aware of the impact of this type of assault. When he was about 10 or 12, his father told him about an incident in which the elder Freud was walking along the sidewalk, all decked out and wearing a new fur cap, when along came a Christian man who knocked the cap into the muck and shouted, "Jew," off the sidewalk. Freud asked his father, "What did you do?" His father answered, "I stepped into the road and picked up my cap." Gay, 1988. Young Freud was deeply disillusioned and developed fantasies of revenge. He identified with the Semite Hannibal, who had sworn to conquer the mighty Romans. He also came to see himself as part of suppressed minority that must always be in opposition to mainstream culture. What Freud did not come to formally conceptualize, or at least to write about, were the terrible costs in narcissistic injury paid by those who are traumatized by oppression. Shaskets-Mergel, 1988, portrays the self-hatred, the internalized racism, born by Jews in Freud's Vienna. Gilman, 1991, wrote of how the modern nose job was invented by a Jewish surgeon practicing in Berlin in 1898 in order to efface the physical remnants of hated Jewishness. As late as the mid-19th century in Europe, Jews were thought of as Black. One author wrote, quoted in Gilman, 1991, page 174, "The African character of the Jew, his muzzle-shaped mouth and face, remove him from other races," and another wrote that the physiognomy of the Jew, which is like that of the Black. Freud needed to see himself as a conquering hero. This part of him has become part of psychoanalysis. But I believe the unconscious aspects of his ethnicity, his self-hatred, also permeate psychoanalysis. Victims tend to blame themselves for their plight, and some versions of psychoanalysis express this self-blame through the wish and the hope that owning the reasons for one's misery will enable one to escape from it. Freud's discovery and assertion of the universality of humankind's base nature also contain a wishful proclamation of his commonality with the ruling class. Jews have always been accused of being too sexual and aggressive. Malcolm X, 1965, wrote, "The Muslim's X symbolized the true African family name that he never could know. For me, my X replaced the white slave master name of Little, which some blue-eyed devil named Little had imposed upon my paternal forebears. We would keep this X until God himself returned to give us a holy name with his own mouth." p. 199. Like Thompson's patients, Malcolm X is defining himself by what he is not. The X denotes an opposition, a negation of what is. X is not. But X is also what is. X is where it is the point of departure and the point of buried treasure. 3. There is no ethnicity. Lacan, 1982, has said that there is no sexual relation. By this he means that there is so much that is fantasy between two people engaged in a sexual relationship, that what is real is largely besides the point. As analysts, we recognize that to call something a fantasy does not mean to diminish its power, but rather instead opens up the possibility of change via relationship and discourse. Fantasies are ideas, and ideas by their nature can change. It is noteworthy that other disciplines such as history and anthropology raise questions about the danger of reifying concepts like culture and ethnicity. Wolff, 1982, wrote, "The central assertion of this book is that the world of humankind constitutes a manifold, a totality of interconnected processes, and inquiries that disassemble this totality into bits and then fail to reassemble them falsify reality. Concepts like nation, society, and culture name bits and threaten to turn names into things." Page 4. It is only in relative recent history that Tuscan, Sicilian, Venetian, and Neapolitan have been replaced by Italian, and Prussian, Bohemian, and Bavarian replaced by German. And who would have thought that Yugoslavs would become Croats, Serbs, Muslim Bosnians, and so forth? It is noteworthy that the Bosnian Muslims who have been ethnically cleansed by the Serbians are also Slavs, sharing looks and many customs, in many of the usual respects ethnically similar to their oppressors. their ancestors having converted from Christianity to Islam with the arrival of the Ottoman Turks in 1463. Presently, 16% of the children of Bosnia are offspring of so-called mixed marriages, FAF, 1992. Once again, a divisive ethnicity has been imposed by those who seek to exploit it. In a recent sociological study, Alba, 1990, concluded for the vast majority of whites living in America, ethnic identity had become a symbolic identity, a vestigial attachment to a few ethnic symbols imposing little cost on everyday life. Nearly 2/3 of all native-born white Americans view themselves as having mixed ethnicity. However, on a not quite conscious level, a new ethnic identity is emerging, that of a European American. From that group, which has little real connection to the customs of Europe, Asians, Latinos, African Caribbeans, and African Americans are excluded. The new European American identity becomes once again an ethnicity of privilege and exclusion. As analysts, it is time for us to come to terms more fully with the fact that ethnicity is an illusion of civilization and to try to understand what unconscious purposes it serves. A psychoanalytic study group including Peter Neubauer, Martin Bergman, and other distinguished analysts met for years trying to understand the sources of anti-Semitism. They concluded that anti-Semitism was unrelated to any particular pathology or character type. They concluded that it must derive from something deep and universal, like stranger anxiety. I feel too that the potential for racism is deep and universal, but is nurtured by context and leadership. Through my clinical work and study of German youth, I have come to see racism in more Kleinian terms. The depressive position, a position that entails owning one's hatred, is always a struggle to maintain. It is always easier to see badness in others than ourselves. Owning our own hatred and potential for destruction requires the support of moral leadership and community, and the potential for making meaningful reparations. There is no ethnicity. There is hatred and the need to deny our own badness and fear of our own hatred. Ethnicity and race are fantasies that we use to deny our own badness and displace it onto others, as well as to protect ourselves against the very real hatred that others may have for us. It is especially important that we confront the fact that dividing the world into black and white is a delusion of civilization. People are not black or white. C. Zuckerman, 1990, where the line is drawn is politically and psychologically motivated. There is no acceptable genetic basis for the concept of race, Cavalli, Sforza, Menazzi, and Piazza, 1994. That race is the only ethnic grouping in this culture that does not allow for the possibility of dual identity, belies its delusional rigidity. Freud wrote that psychoanalysis is a cure though love. We are limited in our ability to work psychoanalytically with people only by or in our inability to love or be loved by them. Anthropologists and soldiers have loved, been loved, and married across all boundaries of culture. It is interesting that a patient Rendon, 1992, could not work with someone he was ethnically identified with, but who was capable of betrayal. This is similar to what Thompson, this issue, called her most obvious treatment failure. Issues of sameness and betrayal can lead to failure of empathy as powerfully as issues of difference. Psychoanalysis is a discipline born in opposition and developed under conditions of oppression. I think for too long in the United States, psychoanalysis, and ego psychology in particular, has tried to deny its multicultural heritage to be part of a mainstream, supposedly non-ethnic, melting pot. As psychologists, we can change that. Javier and Rendon, Herron, Thompson, and others now speak to those who are discriminated against and oppressed not with the voice of an intellectual elite, as part of the medical, therapeutic establishment, or as a group that has made it, but rather with a voice offering a tool for understanding the processes of oppression, subjugation, and their internalization.